Welcome to Urban Connections, a show about the urban environment and its impact on people's physical and mental health. I'm Brooklyn Burns, your host this week. On today's episode, we'll be talking about the difference between spaces and places.
We are not just human beings that walk through a blank space.
Edmonton's marginalized communities.
Why is it that there are certain things that exclude folks?
And the holistic approach to well-being.
We have to think about the ways in which these issues impact each other.
We're joined by Dr. Jennifer Long, a cultural anthropologist and assistant professor at MacEwan University, whose work focuses on urban wellness and building community belonging in Edmonton. Throughout our conversation, we discuss a variety of topics covering different themes. We want to ensure you know that these are Dr. Jennifer Long's opinions and do not reflect those of MacEwan University. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So, for you, what is your role in the Research Institution for Urban Wellness at MacEwan University?
I am one of the collaborators, so whenever I do research, it often has some sort of connection and thread to urban well-being, and my job there is to help integrate students in terms of what projects I have available in order to help build both the profile of the Institute as well as the profile of this center in Edmonton and beyond.
What do you feel is the difference between wellness and well-being?
Well, that's a very difficult thing to answer. And so what I thought I would do was I mentioned this before we started our podcast. I wanted to do some homework to figure out really what the difference was. And so let me just read a definition. And the authors are Kirsten Vanderwalt and Violin. But when we're thinking about what is well-being or what is wellness, from an anthropological perspective, one way that they've described it as is an ecosystemic approach to health, where well-being and wellness are based on two different assumptions. First, that the human being as a whole, a complete person of whom certain attributes can be distinguished but never separated. This anthropology does not allow for health, well-being, and wellness of a person to be attributed to only the absence of disease in the mind or the physical body. The human being is a totality, a complete whole. And so the second assumption flows from the first, vis-a-vis, that is, when we contemplate health, well-being, and wellness of a person, we should approach the matter multidimensionally as well as multidisciplinarily. So as an anthropologist, I really engage with cultural beliefs and values holistically. And so when I think about one's wellness or one's well-being, again, we might tease these concepts apart however you wish, but it always centers the human being in relationship to institutions beyond them, but also how our cultural beliefs and values instigate how we think and develop our own well-being and wellness. I know it's a bit of an answer, non-answer, but I think it's in that gray zone, the difference between the two.
So how do you feel that portrays to what you see here in Edmonton following wellness and well-being?
And that was an interesting question. I had a lot of thoughts about it in terms of, I think what we consider to be well-being or wellness changes over time. And the standards by which we use, the metrics by which we try to discover how people's well-being is doing can change over time. I think there's also a lot of political understandings as to what is wellness, what is well-being. And so I guess what I want to say is what we consider to be well-being are the ways in which people can live a safe and happy and healthy life. And that right now what we're seeing is that there's more individuals who are experiencing a lot of discomfort and lack of safety and a lot of issues because there has been chronic underfunding and undersupporting of really important social services that we tend to have. So I think at the moment we're experiencing quite a health and well-being crisis here in Edmonton.
So when you consider spaces and places, what do you feel is the difference between the definition of spaces and places?
Yeah, so that's actually my angle as to how I look at well-being and wellness. Space is from an anthropological perspective, but this also builds in from social geographers like Yu Fu Tuan. We understand space as being this kind of bucket that's out there. Now, this bucket is not just a blank bucket. There's institutions and people and cultural beliefs and values that build those kind of buckets. But places are these areas where humans infiltrate and they make meaning in these places and they make other people have connections and they associate their relationships in these places. So places are human infused while spaces are the kind of backdrop, the background that all of these kind of different stories and narratives weave together in this social fabric of place.
You talked a lot about marginalized communities and that crisis. So what has motivated you to work with vulnerable and marginalized communities?
Lots of things. I don't know. I think there can be a lot of answers to that question. My mother immigrated to Canada from the Netherlands, and she was a white individual coming with her 7 brothers and sisters and my Oma and Opa. And my Opa had a job when he arrived. So his experience of reintegrating into Canada, while they had a lot of language barriers, they didn't experience things like racism and exclusion, even though this was, back in the 60s. So that was some of the first stories that I heard growing up. I myself, living as a white settler individual, I actually grew up in Ontario, and I had a lot of privilege while I was there. And, socioeconomic, as well as racial privilege, as well as, able-bodied, etc. And growing up in these spaces, I started to just think about, why is it that there are certain things that exclude folks from being allowed to belong or being allowed to, from the perspective of our cultural conventions? Who do we see as Canadians? And why do we even want to exclude folks from this kind of belief or ideology? And so I started looking at that kind of stuff when I went to do my doctoral work, which was in the Netherlands. It looked at Islamophobia as it was built into neighborhood spaces and places. And I looked at it from the perspective of so-called Dutch people. These would be white, formerly Christian, kind of self-described liberals who would also have a lot of Islamophobia in their everyday kind of understanding about who belonged and who didn't in the Netherlands. I then brought those types of questions around majority community belonging into Ontario, doing more research on newcomer settlement. And again, why was it that there were certain newcomers who had different experiences about integrating into local spaces? And I'm not just saying economically, finding financially viable jobs, but also this feeling of belonging and community belonging. And then finally I came to Edmonton, and one of the first things I did was I started to study whiteness and white racial identity among white people to kind of ask, what does this look like? And I happened to start that project in 2019. And of course, in 2020, with the murder of George Floyd, there was a lot more majority community members or white Canadians asking themselves questions around, hey, wait a second, I'm white. What does that mean? And so I studied that for the last couple of years. And so as you can see, these questions, they change over time. And they might have started in one place looking at newcomer settlement and integration and belonging. And they've changed into questions around majority community perceptions around who belongs, because that's the other part of this question. So we should always center voices of those who are excluded, of those who experience racism or exclusion in various levels. But we also need to understand another important question to ask is why these beliefs begin in the first place in order to address them.
Kind of moving forward, could you talk a bit about your time at Recover Edmonton?
I teach a lot of courses, and one of those courses is ethnographic research methods. And in those, I don't want my students just to learn about how to do ethnography. I also want them to get real hands-on experience. And so from the beginning, I wanted to make sure that they had this experience, and so I always collaborated with a community partner. One of the first people I connected with when I came out here in 2018 was actually the City of Edmonton's Recover Urban Wellbeing. And I met a couple of different people, and we just started working on various projects together. We had such a great time, we thought, let's keep going. So every fall, and sometimes even in the winter, I would integrate a project that dealt with well-being as they defined it in various ways. So one of my first projects that we were looking at, following the George Floyd murder of 2020, Edmonton had this 15,000 people came together to protest anti-Black racism and racialized policing in Edmonton. And that was in June 2020. And following that, the mayor at the time, Don Iveson, he said, you know what, let's have a panel and where people can speak about their experiences. And it lasted for 5 days. Now, this was during the COVID lockdown. And so there was people who had time and access. Of course, there was limited access in some ways, but they were able to log on, and they put all these panels online on YouTube. Then what they did, this included actually our President Trimby, they started and created a community safety and well-being task force to kind of make a report about what had happened during these panels. But then they said, yeah, we've got, how long was it? Maybe 32 hours. We have 32 hours of content that you can watch. And everyone's like, 32 hours, that's a long time. So I said, you know what if my students in the ethnographic research methods, what if they, transcribed these panels and then they coded them, they analyzed them, and they created all these fantastic public-facing infographics, documents, and podcasts, etc. What was so great was that these students got to really engage with this material, but then they also were able to provide a lot of, as I say, these outputs, these artifacts. And it's not saying that they believed or disbelieved with what people were saying on that. They were trying to report the information. And so Recover allows me to do that kind of work. Recover, again, this is all about folks here in Edmonton being comfortable with the ways that people are being policed. They want to create a way way in which to stop racialized profiling, experiences of racism when working with security forces, and also to feel safe in this community, of which we know that that's not the case right now. And so working with Recover Urban Wellbeing, they have this fantastic framework, and it's called the Wellbeing Framework. And this was actually built off of ethnographic research methods.
What urban wellness issue do you feel are not addressed enough in and around the Edmonton area?
Well, that's a really difficult thing to answer because I think they all require a lot of response. In and around the Edmonton space, number one, I think it is safe injection sites have been proven through research to be an absolutely important tool and vehicle to help folks live safely and to find different options that would give them a safe and healthy space to live and work in this space. I know there's been a lot of issues around closing down of these sites. This has been politicized, whether or not we are able to provide such services. And we should just be looking at what the research says, which says it is a safe, supportive way for individuals to get to different spaces with, the addictions that they're living with, and that this will save lives. And I think the closing of those sites has been an egregious oversight.
What can we as Edmontonians do to help promote or improve urban wellness or participate in different initiatives, especially in relation to our vulnerable population?
And so what I'll just say is we have to think about the ways in which these issues impact each other. And anthropology calls that a holistic perspective, where you recognize the ways in which these factors depend on each other, so they're interdependent. So if you're going to try to solve a problem over here by putting some money over, in bucket A, that might mean that you have to think about the impacts of what happens when you start to fund that source, but also what happens when you don't fund a source over in bucket B. And I know you can't see what I'm doing here, but I'm making these hand gestures. It's almost like a balance scale, trying to think about, when you focus, it's important to focus on these things that come up, try to address issues, but also thinking 5 years in the past and 5 years in the future to try to understand, what's been done already, what knowledge already exists out there. Can we listen to those experts in the field? And by that, I mean people with lived experience to try to understand how to address the problems that have changed over time, yes, that might have a new context, but who have real understanding about what new measures or interventions, what they might do. So to really center the people whose experiences, that have lived experiences with exclusion, that are not living a well life at the moment, whose well-being could be improved, putting their voices at the center to try to change these things.
In your words, how important are human connections and our connections to our immediate and surrounding environment?
I really appreciated this question. We are not just human beings that walk through a blank space. It's everything around us. We also have to think about other species that are around us, the ways in which the animals, the environment, our air, the water, the kind of food we're able to consume, the spaces that become places of great importance to us. This is all going into, and again, this goes back to Recover's urban well-being framework, which is just so fantastic to think about how all these different facets can play a role in improving our well-being. I know I've looked at in the past, what role can the university play in creating community and senses of belonging within and among the student body and also the larger community around us. And I've looked at that in terms of the library most recently. So in 2023, we looked at the ways in which, this is through my ethnographic research methods course, as well as through an applied anthropology course, which I teach as a design anthropology course. This past year in winter 2024, I did that in collaboration with Wayne Williams from Design, who's fabulous. And what we did was we looked at how do people feel about using the library? Is it a space they feel like represents them? And when does it become, when they engage with people who might be seen as outside the student body, are they still part of that community? And if so, how and why? And these fabulous students in my class created these new data collection tools by which the library could use to kind of measure how people are feeling about different library spaces. And so I think what all this, in conclusion, thinking about the role of space and place and how we build being within it, the importance of context and centering the voices of those who have deep knowledge about what it means to be well and what wellness means for them, and also seeing how past policies have worked and not, but also trying to depoliticize what has been really well researched by well-being experts around the importance of health and treating a human holistically.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge with us. We really appreciate that.
Thanks very much for having me.
Now, we have co-producer and MacEwan student Lyra Brown, who will dive deeper into information surrounding safe injection sites and harm reduction on the MacEwan campus.
While many classes for communication students take place in Allard Hall, the newest and most architecturally striking building in MacEwan, it is far too easy to forget or to be willfully ignorant regarding what goes on outside the building. The issue of addiction and the unhoused community is undeniable and tragic. Safe injection sites for this population should be implemented instead of blaming these individuals for their circumstances. Edmonton, along with many other provinces in Canada, is experiencing an opioid crisis. This is a multifaceted public health issue that has led to a significant increase in opioid overdoses and deaths in Edmonton. By establishing more clinics like the City Centre Clinic, or perhaps introducing naloxone kits at MacEwan for students to have on hand, hundreds of lives could be saved in this urban area. MacEwan students can also participate in the Coalition for Harm Reduction at MacEwan by collaborating with campus and community members to help create a supportive campus for all.
Thanks for joining us on Urban Connections. This week's episode was produced by Jada Hubert, Amanda Andrick, Emma Morrison, Lyra Brown, Brooklyn Burns, and Christina Felker. The show was edited by Emma Morrison. The show's supervising producer is Sheena Rossiter. Additional studio supervision by Sasha Stanovich. This episode was produced as part of the BCSC 302 online content production course in the fall 2024 semester. The course is part of the Bachelor of Communication Studies program in the Department of Communication at MacEwan University. The show was edited and produced out of the MacEwan Media Production Studio. The show is a collaboration between the Department of Communication and the Research Institute for Urban Wellness at MacEwan University. Our theme music is called Creativity by Kaylee Lambert. Additional music is called Serenade and Midnight Shadows by Erica R. The logo design for this podcast is by Sasha Stanovich. And I'm Brooklyn Burns, your host for this week's episode. This podcast was recorded on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional and ancestral territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis settlements in the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 9, 10, and 11 within the historical North Saskatchewan River Territory. Don't forget to subscribe to Urban Connections on your podcast app, and please leave us a review and rating. It really helps people find the show. Please join us again next time when we explore more urban connections.